Good morning or good afternoon wherever you are. I'm John Lanker. I'm a senior sales engineer with Lucidworks, and this is a webinar session called Getting the Most Out of SharePoint. So today we're going to talk about SharePoint Search in particular and how to get more out of it, and we'll talk about how SharePoint and other products pair really well that specialize in certain things like search. We'll also talk about, just briefly, measuring ROI on enterprise search or workplace search in general and why you'd want to do that and why it actually makes sense to do it in comparison to something like e-commerce where it's much more quantifiable. You can actually quantify it on the workplace side of the world as well. So we'll talk about that too. But first, let's talk about what SharePoint does really well. So one of the reasons I like to deliver this talk is there are some things about SharePoint that makes it great, considering that it's I believe the second highest revenue producer for Microsoft behind Windows itself. It certainly is popular and it does a lot of things well, and many businesses and people around the world use it. Well, why does it do things well, or what does it do well? If you work in SharePoint, you know that document management is certainly one of its strong suits, especially if it's Office content. It also does people management very well, and by that I mean things like My Sites and collaboration or integration with Active Directory. So if you have information about people within a company in AD or within the My Sites of SharePoint, you can learn a lot about a person and you can collaborate with coworkers and team members really well using the concept that people hold in SharePoint itself. It's also great for internet infrastructure, which is why a lot of companies have built their server farms in SharePoint, and they have these elaborate installations of the product that their business completely relies on in some cases for their internet. It's great at collaboration, meaning document sharing, multi-editing, things of that nature. And if you want to connect to anything in the Microsoft world, like a OneDrive repository or something in Azure, all of that stuff is built in, seeing it as it's a Microsoft product. And this is now a little bit expanded with Graph, and we'll talk about Microsoft Graph here in a few minutes, but these are the things it does really well. So what about the other side of things, the things that it really doesn't do well? Well, first on that list is content ingestion, especially when you're not using Graph. So before Graph came around, if you have an older version of SharePoint, if you are a company that has a slow-moving process when it comes to upgrading or moving forward with technology, a lot of federal government customers, state government customers are like this. I've dealt with some law firms that are in this mindset as well. They get a technology, and once it's adopted, they don't move it forward rapidly. They like to take their time. They're not keen on new releases. So a lot of companies out there are still on SharePoint 2013, believe it or not. Some even on 2010. A lot of companies are still on 16 or 19, and even though Microsoft has pushed people to go to SharePoint Online and Office 365, that has been adopted in large numbers, of course, but not quite as wide a variety of adoption across SharePoint. So content ingestion is one of the big pain points in on-prem or legacy SharePoint. So anything that's SharePoint 2019 or prior, I'll refer to as on-prem or legacy, and SharePoint Online or Office 365, I can simply refer to as online for the purposes of this talk. Okay, the second thing on the list is search. We're going to talk a lot about that. Third thing, design site customization. Well, this is limited to what you're doing in SharePoint, and there's a lot of UI considerations and other UX experience type things in here that we can talk about, but this is not the purpose of the talk. It's just one of the things on the list. Of course, here comes search again. And then we have application variety. There's not a whole lot of variety within SharePoint in terms of applications that you can produce with it. So if you have SharePoint, you're not necessarily going to have an e-commerce shop or like anything outside of a collaboration platform. It's really not designed for those things, but it's designed for other things, which we covered that it does very well. It happens to include these other facets, which in my mind, in my experience, they're not focuses for Microsoft. They're just boxes that are checked. And one of those boxes that gets checked to say that we offer search is the search product itself within SharePoint. So did I mention search as not being one of SharePoint's advantages? It's certainly not. Well, why is that true, and what can we do to fix it? This list that we're going to see on this slide is the top 6 or so things that you do to change how SharePoint's effectiveness in search is seen by the users. First is boosting on keywords, boosting on proximity, boosting on freshness, on file type, a custom spelling dictionary, making synonyms equal to each other, ingesting non-office structured content. And this is something that I'll just add another note to here. This is anything, like the previous slide mentioned, anything that comes from the Office world or the Microsoft world pairs very well with SharePoint. Well, anything that does not pair well with SharePoint. And then finally, the underlying theme of all of these changes to SharePoint Search will be customizing a rank profile. We're going to talk about each of these things individually here and go into detail. The first one is keyword boost. So you may have seen this if you're experienced in SharePoint Search without even knowing it. You also might be acutely aware of it. But this is one of the big problems where you can create a managed property, or you have a custom column on a document library, for example. And when you have this property ingested into search, it has a default weight at which it's ranked. And you can see here on the right side of the slide in the screenshot, there's a weight group for a managed property. So if I go and edit a managed property and I change the weight group, those contexts are all different groups, and they're worth more to the ranking algorithm than the other context. So for example, context 1 is probably worth more than context 2, if I remember correctly. Anyway, suffice it to say that just because you create a property for a document library or a list and you ingest that property in a search does not mean that when you search for things, that property is going to be given the consideration that it's due. And this is a problem that a lot of search admins and users in SharePoint aren't even aware of, because they're not aware of the weight group property within managed properties themselves. So this is one thing that if you're curious as to why, for example, a classification or a category property that you've added to a doc library, and you start populating with data and you ingest that library into search, and you start searching for that category by name, if you're curious why the results don't seem to reflect that information, it might be due to the fact that the weight of that particular managed property is not appropriate. It's too low for search. Now, this is something that you can do in something called XRank, and we'll talk a little bit about XRank. If you don't know what XRank is, it's simply a syntax for changing search dynamically. So you can affect search results dynamically in SharePoint with XRank. And then, of course, you would do this in a custom rank profile, which is only possible through on-prem SharePoint right now. Custom rank profiles are a tedious, laborious process, and I'm going to mention them a lot in this talk, because if you really want to get the most out of SharePoint Search, you would do custom rank profiles, but they're very difficult to do. So that's why we're covering more of the easier things to do here with these slides. Next is proximity boosting. So one of the problems that you see with proximity boosting in SharePoint is that you can have 2 words in a title of a document. Of course, they're right next to each other. So by proximity, this means how close are the words together, meaning are they within 1 term of each other, 2, 3, or more? The closer the proximity, the closer you can get to 0, which means they're right next to each other, the more relevant that item should be to the search term entered, assuming it has 2 or more words. We'll see an example of this here in a second. But this is something that plagues SharePoint because it is so keyword driven that if your search term, let's say you have a 2-word search term, if your search term covers many hits in the document itself without really the hitting in the title, or even if it does hit in the title, SharePoint will rank the documents that contain those terms in the body much more highly than the terms in the title. And there's an example of this that we can show you here. Well, by the way, this is the XRank query that you would use to change that, so I'll go back to that in a second. But here's an example of what would happen. So on the left, this is a search for internal medicine, as you can see, and the matches that you're getting in results before you do any kind of proximity boosting, you can see in the hit highlighting there that they're matches on body or description of the document. And more often than not, and special cases of course do exist, but more often than not, when the title of a document contains what the user searched for, that item is probably most relevant. So on the right side of the slide is where we see after proximity boosting, we search for the same two words, internal medicine. We're getting matches on documents that have this in the title. And that 9 times out of 10 is what the user wants. So how do you achieve that? Well, if you take an XRank manipulation and you put this into a result source or any other kind of search results manipulation, you can dynamically boost, which is what this CB equals here, CB equals 100. You're putting a heavier boost on the title containing those search terms, and you're putting a boost on the search terms being in the document at all. And that constant boost value of 100 is just arbitrary. It's just for example purposes. But the next part of this is what's really important. If you add title contains search terms, we're boosting that by a factor of 5,000. So that's going to correct the problem that SharePoint has out of the box with not recognizing the fact that words in a title are certainly more important in most cases than words in a body. Next example is freshness. Now this is more business specific than some of the other changes that we'll be making here, but freshness is something that is often important to a news site or to, let's say, a law firm that has a case, an ongoing case or an ongoing litigation, and there are new documents added to this case on a daily basis, sometimes an hourly basis. Think of social media as another platform that takes advantage of freshness. So freshness is simply how new is the information. That's all this means in the context of search. The problem with SharePoint Search is that freshness is missing entirely, so that if you were to search for something, you might get a random assortment of documents that match your search, regardless of when they were created or last modified. And this is done definitely best in a rank profile, as all these things are done. However, you can do this with XRank as well, and you can see in the screenshot here, there is an XRank right here in the query box where I'm adding a tiny boost, in this case 1, constant boost, CB equals 1, to the right property, which in SharePoint is basically last modified or authored, whenever it's greater than a certain date. And this is something that I don't understand why it's not done by default, but I've had so many SharePoint consultation engagements where freshness has been a problem for a customer or an end user, and they don't even know it until they see the most recent document being presented first. So here's a difference, again, a comparison of what you would do before and after freshness. So you can see on the left we don't have our right property with XRank, and we have this document entitled Medi97 in the second position there. After the freshness boost with our XRank edition on the right, that same document moves up to first position. So again, this is not something you would put a heavy boost on. In this case, it's only 1. But you certainly want to impact freshness, because if two documents all are the same in every other way, let's say if you search for internal medicine, you have document A and document B, they're identical except that document B was authored today and document A was authored last year, you're most likely going to want to show the result that was authored today. So this is where you need to push SharePoint along a little bit and give that search mechanism a boost on freshness. Boosting on file type is next. So file type is, again, very curiously done in SharePoint Search in terms of what file types rank ahead of other ones. So if you were to run a search like internal medicine and get back hits on all kinds of types like PowerPoint, Word, Excel, PDF, most often, and this is across most of the on-prem versions of SharePoint that I have seen, PowerPoint files will always rank ahead for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why this is done. I've never been able to find information on this. If it's out there, I haven't come across it, but all things being equal, PowerPoint files seem to rank ahead of other documents in the SharePoint search world. The affinity for PowerPoint over other items often doesn't make sense for most businesses. Some businesses it certainly does, and so it's desired. But in a lot of my experience with a lot of different types of companies, their knowledge workers are most often interested in PDF or Word content over a PowerPoint content. So to change boosting on file type, you would want to do something like this. Again, we're using XRank, and we want to give higher boost to file types of PDF and Word, so 5 and 3 respectively, and then we can actually do negative boosting in SharePoint Search with a -1 on PowerPoint. So that'll help put things into a proper rank and file in terms of boosting on file type by itself. The next one is spelling dictionary. Now this is something that is common in most people today with the amount of shopping online and other online resources that people have access to, and social media included. Spelling and typos and things in search is common. But in the workplace, when this sort of thing happens and people are frustrated by the results, then the way SharePoint Search handles it is just certainly not adequate out of the box. And one of the ways you can change this is to create your own spelling dictionary in SharePoint Search. And this is actually the only way in on-prem SharePoint that you get type ahead within SharePoint itself. So what SharePoint Search offers in terms of type ahead results can only be driven through a custom spelling dictionary. So if you want type ahead, you have to do this, but really the greatest value of it is that you can control misspellings, and you ought to do this because in the workplace, without doing anything past default SharePoint Search, you're going to have users running into spelling problems. You can also create an exclusion list that will help mitigate these problems as well. This next one is certainly very interesting. So you can create synonyms in SharePoint Search, and like any decent search engine out there, synonyms will need to be handled. However, without taking action on on-prem SharePoint, and this is something I'll admit I have not tested in SharePoint Online, but in all of the on-prem or legacy versions, if you do not do this, you would create a synonym, for example, TV and television, and whatever the synonym that gets created, whatever that term is, if the user searches for that term, it's only weighted 20% of the original term. So, for example, if I create a synonym for television of TV, and then the user searches for TV, the items that are ranked in the results set are only going to receive 20% of the weight that television would. Again, not sure why this would be the case, but this is something that you had to take action on via PowerShell in the past. In SharePoint Online, this may have been fixed. I did not check on that for the purposes of this presentation, but if you're a legacy SharePoint user out there, this would be something to pay attention to. Next is ingesting structured content. So when you have structured content like we're seeing with these examples, this is all clinical trials data. The internal medicine example is coming from clinical trials, all publicly available, but it's all available via XML. So when you have this sort of data, SharePoint has, of course, crawlers for source systems and puts that information into search. However, like we said in the original couple slides, if it's not a part of the Microsoft ecosystem or not in that Microsoft world, it doesn't connect to these things very well. Now, this is where Graph has come in, and Graph has really helped because of the different connections and API mechanisms it can provide to get things into SharePoint Search. But if you're using a legacy version of SharePoint especially, you're probably not up to date with using Graph. So what are your alternatives? Well, if I were to take a clinical trials XML file like this and pull it into SharePoint Search by just crawling a file share, let's say I pull the entire clinical trials XML corpus into a doc library in SharePoint. Well, those are just all XML files. And if I crawl those files, the entire block of XML, so what you see here is just a snippet of one of these files, but the entire file goes into the body of the searchable document in SharePoint. That is certainly not desirable. It's definitely not helpful, because when people search for things like dates, like you can see here, start date, completion date of this particular trial, you might want to categorize certain types of metadata appropriately so that you can facet on them for one, or filter on them, and you can also target searching. But with everything going into the body, it's just one giant assortment of terms, and so you're going to get so much noise in search results it makes your head spin. This is a problem that you face if you are, for example, a law firm that has decades worth of documents in something like IBM FileNet or in NetDocuments, or you're a different sort of, let's say you're an insurance company and you have a CMS like LifeRay. Well, these are all things that live outside the SharePoint world or the Microsoft world, and more often than not, one of the problems I've seen customers have with SharePoint is that they try to get all of that stuff into SharePoint Search because that's their intranet platform, and they have to use it for everything, including search, and that causes problems when they try to go outside and connect to these other source systems and try to do things that reach beyond the Microsoft borders, if you will. So what can you do about that? Do you have an alternative to using something other than SharePoint for search within SharePoint? I know that sounds kind of strange, but you certainly do have alternatives. And as the title of this, subtitle of this talk comes, it's Let Lucidworks Fusion Handle Search. And we're going to look at why you would want to do this. So I see SharePoint with all of its advantages that we covered and all of the things that it doesn't do very well, and Fusion as a perfect marriage. So Lucidworks Fusion is a product that will provide the search that SharePoint desperately needs, all while allowing your users to live within SharePoint. In fact, many of our customers, especially in a particular region of the world, came to us and said, we have all these SharePoint installations, we have other customers or partners of ours that use SharePoint, but they are completely against going out of SharePoint for any kind of searching. If we're going to get a better search product, it has to be within the SharePoint context. It has to all look the same. The users want to see that same experience, and so on and so forth. Well, most of the time when you approach someone with this question, they'll say, well, do I have to abandon SharePoint to use a different search product? And the answer is no. And why is this a perfect marriage? Well, Lucidworks, first of all, provides search for the world's largest SharePoint implementation. This is a top 3 oil and gas company. You could probably guess, if you guess 3 names, you're probably right on one of them. They have billions of items in SharePoint. They had billions hundreds of thousands of users using billions of items, and they moved all of that content out of SharePoint Search into Fusion. And one of the nice things about this particular marriage was that if you use SharePoint, you know how important security is, especially document-based security, especially user and group permissions. All of those things are honored by Fusion when content from SharePoint gets ingested into Fusion Search. Another reason that Fusion augments this SharePoint experience is the rich AI and machine learning models that are included with Fusion, as well as the ability to use third-party models. Now, Microsoft has made some advancements here in recent years with, I think, the last 18 months or so, with cognitive services. And that's one of the things that has helped them bridge this gap with search, but there's still a lack of ability to support a homegrown model or a third-party model. And by that I mean, let's say you want to do entity recognition. Let's say you want to crawl content and pick out things like colors or brand names or names of airlines or whatever it may be, people, and you want to put that through an entity extractor, and you want to use cognitive services. You can use what Microsoft gives you for cognitive services, or you could actually build your own model in Python or hire someone to, for example, a data scientist, to create a custom model for you and your business using something like Jupyter Notebook with Python. That's just one example. Fusion also allows you to plug in third-party models that are already created, so something like Rex from Basis Tech or Spacey, any of those open source models. These are the types of things that plug into Fusion much better than they do into SharePoint and Cognitive Services from Microsoft. The other thing that bridges this gap with SharePoint Search is the connector suite that comes with Fusion. So we talked about a few minutes ago how when you try to get outside that Microsoft world with connecting to other data sources, you run into trouble. With Fusion, you have dozens of data sources with connectors already built. So if you need to go out to Couchbase or go out to Splunk or some other data source, a lot of companies have lots of information in other places besides SharePoint, and their effort to get it all into SharePoint is often very painful, as I was noting earlier. So the alternative is to use a different search platform and pull all of that content, including the SharePoint content, into that search platform. Fusion also offers you complete control over all aspects of search. So one of the things that we've talked about in the previous 10 or so slides is that you have some control over search, and if you want complete control over SharePoint Search, you've got to get into customizing rank profiles. You've also got to get into some of the really difficult, tedious algorithmic work and mathematical formula work that goes into SharePoint Search rank profiles. With Lucidworks Fusion, you don't have that tediousness associated with it. You can actually control every aspect of search down to the configuration of the search engine, from synonyms to request handlers to everything under the sun. So there's a lot more you can do in terms of exerting control over the search engine, which in my experience, in my past life as a SharePoint consultant, the customers complained about the most. We cannot control search. It's too much of a black box. Here's something that I mentioned already once, but I wanted to add something to it. So I mentioned Cognitive Services from Microsoft. There's another offering that they've come out with called Syntax. And one of the things you can do with Syntax, for example, is you can classify content right in line. So let's say you have some items in a document library in SharePoint, and you want to classify them, as in you want to come up with some way to intelligently determine what category a document belongs to. Well, that involves machine learning. And Syntax from Microsoft allows you to exert machine learning models that they build and do classification of items right in line inside the library. This is great. It's wonderful that Microsoft has added this capability to SharePoint, and any SharePoint user or shop should take advantage of this. However, where it ends is right there in the document library. So again, we're talking about, what if I have content from other places? What if I want to be able to search that content that I've just now augmented with Syntax? So let's say you've classified a bunch of items in your library. Well, now we're going back to that same situation where if I pull that information as a search, do the managed properties get weighted appropriately? Is freshness and other things like proximity, are those things enabled? Are those things ready to go? Are they completely under my control? So what I envision here for Cognitive Services and Syntax users is take advantage of all of the things that Microsoft has offered with those products. They are really, really nice offerings. And then take what they produce and how they augment your content, and then put that into Fusion, and therefore augmenting search even more than you would without them. The other thing in the Fusion world that's really nice compared to administering search in SharePoint is there's a visual drag and drop search management UI. Now, this is a product that we offer called Predictive Merchandiser, and by name you would think it's solely for e-commerce, but it's actually not. There are a lot of workplace customers that have seen this and said, oh, wow, we really want to have that sort of control over our search front end. And it's essentially a way for you as a search admin to look at the results that an end user would see for any given query and start boosting and blocking and moving things around into certain positions if you wanted to do that. Of course, which is why the product got its name, but it's also spilled over into the workplace world, which we did not anticipate, but it's the same sort of management that you would get if you were to look at a bunch of results and start moving them around with your mouse. that's something that you can't do in SharePoint. You just kind of have to toil through and test things and look at results live to see what your changes are doing. Another thing that Fusion provides that greatly enhances the search admin experience and then subsequently the end user experience is a query and index workbench. So how do I test what a change to my querying is going to do? What do I see in terms of metadata that's coming through if I connect to this new data source? I want to test this first before I start crawling it. Well, unfortunately, in SharePoint, you are very limited in how you can test something before you actually do it. And then in a product like Fusion, putting a search into it, instead, you'll have access to things like this. And finally, probably not finally, but next to last here, a huge one is using the behavior of the end users to your advantage. You have to leverage that information and get it to work for you. And we call this, in our world, signals. And Cognitive Services from Microsoft is doing some of this, but it's just not far-reaching enough yet, and I don't think Microsoft, frankly, is investing enough in it. I think they really need to invest more. But again, I see Microsoft as taking a look at search and saying, yes, we offer that, check the box, but they're not really using their vast resources and horsepower to really make it better. And so with signals, you can learn what your users are doing. They click on things, they download things, they might bookmark something or click a button that says email to colleague. These sorts of actions are called signals, and it's behavior that the search engine can use to make future queries like the one that was just run better. So when the search engine learns that users are doing X, Y, and Z actions on a set of results, it will make note of that and therefore get smarter and smarter over time to improve relevancy organically and without the oversight of a search admin. And then the last thing here that I want to talk about just briefly is leveraging Microsoft Graph. So Graph does a lot of different things for you. It takes advantage of the Microsoft ecosystem, and there is an advantage to living completely in Microsoft's world. So for example, if you have a reporting structure in your company and you have an employee that has a manager that's working on a document, Cognitive Services and Graph knows that that employee is managed by that other employee. So it understands the workplace hierarchy. It also understands team context. So within Active Directory or SharePoint, you can say that 10 individuals belong to a certain team, and therefore anything that's produced by that team is more relevant to that individual user in search. Graph can make all of that stuff happen for you. Well, again, another reason this is a perfect marriage, meaning SharePoint and Fusion, is that Fusion can actually call Graph. So Microsoft opened up the Graph world to API. That means anybody can call it just like they would call any API on the internet. So you can call APIs internal to your workplace through Graph inside Fusion and get all of the Microsoft ecosystem advantages that you want to use in SharePoint Search. You can use them in Fusion Search, but now with all of the advantages that something like Fusion would provide. So let's take a quick look at that in just 1 second. And then the last bullet here, sorry that I forgot this one. Everything that you do in Fusion is an API call. It can be an API call. So when I mentioned earlier that retaining the SharePoint experience is important to a lot of customers, this is one way that you can keep your front end within SharePoint. So if you have a site template or a search center that is kind of off limits to change, you really don't have to change it at all unless you want to change the API calls on the back end. So we've actually had customers in APAC do this where they were so interested in keeping that same experience, they just went and changed the API calls from SharePoint Search to Fusion behind the scenes, and the end user really didn't see the difference until they liked the search results a lot better. They just had no idea what was going on in the back end. So about Graph. This is just a visual representation of what Graph can do for us. So you see the user in the middle. I mentioned if you look to about the 10 o'clock position from her circle, you see the manager tree, and then there's another one right next to that trending around, and it points to a Word document. And then you have another spoke on this wheel, probably about the 8 o'clock position, that says she's a member of a group, and then another one next to that says she's working with so-and-so. These are the types of things that a Microsoft ecosystem knows about all of its users and all of its content, And this is something that you can get at with Graph. And this is something that we have done in a prototype for another customer where we actually use Graph to enhance our signals that we create. So I mentioned signals a minute ago. We can actually beef up the signals that we produce through Fusion with Graph information, making them even more powerful. Okay, so this is all great. We talked about how we can make search better. Why would you invest the time to do this? Why would you do this at all? Why would you invest the money to do this? What's the return on investment? And your pushback right now is probably, well, you can measure that in e-commerce because people buy things, and that means that you can quantify it very easily. You can't do that in the workplace. There's nothing to sell or buy, so there's no way to measure ROI. And I would like to be able to have the chance to change your mind a bit on that. So in the workplace context, you can measure ROI. You can actually do it quantitatively, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. You also want to do it qualitatively. Well, why would you want to do both of those things? Well, if you think about the Pepsi challenge that used to occur years ago where people would be blindfolded and they'd taste Coke and they'd taste Pepsi, and then they tell the vendor which one they like better. Most often, of course, they're going to pick Pepsi on the TV commercials because it was a Pepsi initiative. That's an example of a qualitative measurement. So which one do you like better? And the way you do this in the workplace is you actually interview users. You can A/B test with your users. This is something that Fusion offers you out of the box, not possible with something like SharePoint Search. You can actually do experimentation. You can put two different search experiences in front of two different sets of users and then interview those people and say, what do you like better? And the reason that this is actually meaningful, and I know that it probably sounds silly, but it's meaningful because I've actually had these discussions. I've been in front of end users at a bunch of different industry companies, and they've all said, using X, Y, and Z about search really stinks, or I can't do this when I type X, Y, and Z, or I can't find this type of document. I can never find it. I have to go to this other place to find it, and so on and so forth. And so those types of things are meaningful. And why is that meaningful? Well, you definitely want the morale of your knowledge workers to be as high as possible. And the way to kill morale with knowledge workers is to make things tedious for them, make them annoyed by their experience with technology, and just frustrate them in their ability to get their work done. So helping morale is a qualitative measurement of ROI that really you can't put a price on. And people become more productive when they're happier. There are all these things that you can measure qualitatively, but the big one that is meaningful to someone who writes checks is the quantitative measure. So you definitely want to do both. I hope I explained that properly. But we want to look at an example of how you can actually do this quantitatively. The value that you'll get out of it, of course, I mentioned people become more productive when their morale is higher. They're actually more efficient. And when we look at our quantitative example, efficiency was one of the measurements, and I'll show you how. But when they're more efficient, they get more done, which does actually impact your bottom line, just not as directly as if you sell more this month versus last month on your e-com site. The other reason this is valuable to business is that you have an evolving solution. A lot of the times that I walked into a SharePoint project as a consultant, I saw someone that said, let's say this was the year 2014, I saw a customer that said, well, we're on SharePoint 2010, we haven't changed anything in over a year, and we know SharePoint 2013 is out, but we can't upgrade to it, and we're just kind of happy with status quo. Well, an evolving solution with another product like Fusion means something is always going to be grown and enhanced. Upgrades are a lot easier. The upgrade paths are much quicker. SharePoint Online does solve a lot of these problems, but again, this is for those legacy customers out there that haven't moved over yet, especially. The other thing, of course, at the very bottom of this slide is doing these things saves money. And let's look at the quantitative way to measure that. So this is actually a customer of ours. It's a customer that I've interviewed extensively over a number of years to keep up with these metrics. This company, there are two giant rideshare companies that operate in the world, so take a guess. You're probably going to be right in a matter of seconds which one you guess this is. But they actually set out to measure their ROI on their investment with us. And keep in mind, they did not measure their external-facing app. So their riders and their drivers It did not affect this. It only affected their intranet, their workplace setting. And when I interviewed their people about this, I was just blown away. And I'll tell you why here. First of all, they did this in 2 phases. So they only did this measurement in phase 1, which means they hadn't rolled it out completely yet. On top of that, they only rolled it out to 50% of their users. So I can imagine what would happen if they had rolled it out to the entire 100% of their users. They also used some baseline numbers. So they came up with $50 an hour as an average salary for their knowledge workers. And with all of their people, it totaled 700 work hours a day. Now their goal, if you can think about this, using a standard 8-hour day, and we all know that most people work more on average, their goal was to save each person just 2 minutes in a day. And you might think, well, gosh, that seems really easy. Or, no, that doesn't seem easy. How do you get 2 minutes of time saved? Well, when you search for things, you probably don't even realize how much time is elapsing when you run searches, especially search after search after search. That sort of thing over an 8-hour workday or more adds up. So this company said, we want to just save 2 minutes. Let's start really low. We want the bar to be easily accessible. We don't want to go pie in the sky. We'll start with 2 minutes. So doing this and using these baseline metrics and watching the metrics that Fusion provided in terms of how many queries led to null results, how many users searched again after they ran their first search, which usually means they weren't happy with the results. How often did they click on something when they took action, meaning they clicked on a filter? And another important one was dwell time. How long did it take them to click on a result after they ran their search? This is where a lot of that 2 minutes came in. Well, after all of this was computed, they said they estimated they saved about $650,000 a month with paying their average salaries to their workers. This turned into, based on their investment in Fusion, an ROI of 15 to 20 times per year, which simply blew me away. So I had to say, you really need to show me how you did this. I don't believe you got that out of it. And we went through several interviews to get to the information. Of course, we don't have time to go into every detail here on this call, but just suffice it to say that this can be done and it is measurable. So at this point, I just want to stop and ask if there are any questions. We're just about out of time for a presentation, so let's get into question mode here.
Sorry about that, John. I was on mute. Thank you for that incredibly insightful presentation. A lot of prescriptive guidance in there. We had a question from Robert that came in at the earlier portion of the presentation. Robert said they had a communication from Microsoft that they were removing query rule capabilities from SP Online, that they would likely include removing query rule ranking using XRank. They indicated that they would also be deprecating the authoritative pages option in SP Online Search. They've not seen it take effect yet and not sure if it will. Any thoughts on this, John?
Robert, that's a great question. I think this is actually terrible news from Microsoft. I wasn't actually aware of that. I had not seen that communication from them. But if that's true, then if you can't use XRank, you really are going to be handcuffed with what you can do in terms of controlling search. So if they're planning to provide an alternative through COG services or something else, I hope that's what they're going to do. But it seems like your only real control would be doing a complete custom rank profile, which I'm not sure you can fully flesh out in SharePoint Online. So if they deprecate the authoritative pages, then you would have to fall back on editing web parts, I think, for the search results web parts and the refinement parts, and make some calls out to other services. So I'm thinking you would have to create your own service to mimic an authoritative page and then call out to it from your search results web part, for example. So that's an alternative you might want to look into. SPFX is the technology from Microsoft that would allow you to answer these questions. But the XRank thing is really troubling to me because that's, like you saw, that's one of the main ways you can control search. So hopefully that's not the case.
All right, thanks for your feedback there. Ronnie is interested in knowing if there are any hints about scaling and performance in SharePoint searching.
That's a good question, Ronnie. I think with SharePoint Search, you have a traditional columns equals capacity, and you have rows equals redundancy set up, because SharePoint at its root is FAST. If you're not familiar with FAST, it's the Scandinavian search company that Microsoft bought in 2008. And FAST ESP, which stood for Enterprise Search Platform, was the standard for a lot of big companies like Autotrader.com, CareerBuilder.com. And FAST scaled extremely well with columns equaling capacity. If you are asking this question in an on-prem context, that's going to be what you'll want to do, is scale out your capacity with columns, meaning your search servers would scale out in a column format, and then you would have redundant indexes with rows. And I'm happy, if you want to email our team, I'm happy to go over that in more detail with you. But in terms of performance, the best way to affect indexing performance is decide whether your search needs are more read heavy or more write heavy, because if whichever way they are, and if they're not either of those things, if you need both of them to perform very well, then that's a different story. But based on which one of those is more prominent in your solution, you'll want to scale your search engine differently.
Okay, and Manesh has asked, how do you train the domain the user groups are interested in?
How do you train the domain the user groups are interested in? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that question. All
right, Manesh, why don't you type in
Are you still on the line? Do you mind clarifying that?
Yeah, Manesh, if you're there, just type into your question section, a little bit more specifically what you're looking for, so John can answer. I also just did want to direct everybody to the lower right-hand side of your viewing console. There is a resources section. We have a few questions here, and so John, maybe you can walk us through those resources. The questions I'll go through are, what is the best resource for me to learn about creating a custom rank profile?
Yes, those links are directly from Microsoft's documentation, and if you go visit those links, you will see just how intimidating it can be to look at creating a custom rank profile, which is why I've spent a long time trying to figure out what are the best ways to do this through XRank or other mechanisms where I can gain control over search, because rank profiles, rank profiles were part of FAST ESP, and they were extremely flexible. You could do so much stuff in a rank profile within FAST, mainly because it was driven all through XML. But with Microsoft purchasing FAST, they really obscured that, and there's a lot less you can do directly through controlling a profile like through XML. So ranking became much more tedious, and it's a lot more difficult to do in a custom rank profile. But the resources are there, because if you really want to stick with SharePoint Search for the long haul, and especially if you're an on-prem user, you're going to want to come up with a custom rank profile. It's really the only way to get the most out of it. And I see that Manesh has posted a follow-up here.
Yeah, so Manesh, thank you so much for getting back to us. So the follow-up to how do you train the domain the user groups are interested in, if I'm in a capital markets group in a bank, how will the ML models understand our lingo?
Excellent question. So thank you for the clarification. This is a great question to ask because it ties in very nicely with what we were talking about earlier in the session, which is using a third-party model or building your own model. So one of the things I understand that SharePoint Syntax will do is you can actually train your own model using your own data. So this is something that you would also do with Fusion, by the way, and it's something that I do on a regular basis. So if you want to craft something that's particular to your business, so in your case you're saying understanding your own lingo, you really have two options. You can use a model that is similar enough to your industry. So if it's the financial industry, obviously, that you're in, you can find financial classification models, third-party models, and you can finely tune them for your unique lingo or acronyms, things of that nature. The other thing you can do is train a model completely from scratch. And I think syntax will allow you to do this better than the first option. So let's say you have 100,000 items in your SharePoint corpus. You could go into these libraries inside the library itself with syntax and then start training a model. And by that I mean you tell the model, here are all the documents and the field, let's say it's the body or the title, and the fields that I want you to evaluate to come up with an understanding of our lingo. So you point the syntax mechanism, or in the case of Fusion, you would actually just put all these documents into a search collection and say, and go run a job. You would actually run a job that says, here are the documents, and here is the field that identifies the content, maybe it's body, and here's the field that I want you to use as output for understanding the classification of that item. And if those documents contain the lingo, then you will have an automated way of producing a model that understands the lingo so that you can classify future things. If you don't have content that has the lingo in it, you can always mock up your own content with a label value pair. So if you have a synonym dictionary, for example, you can have, if you have an acronym or a lingo that a term for something that means something else more formal, then you can just pair those things together as synonyms and put that in a synonym dictionary. That's actually a quicker way to achieve value, but doing a data model that would analyze it automatically is a longer-term solution. It's just a little more tedious.
All right. And then this one's on Fusion. What sort of behavior does Lucidworks track?
Great question. There are a lot of out-of-the-box behaviors. So if you can think of what you do, let's say the easiest thing for most people to think of is shopping. Let's say you're shopping. If you go to a website and you do some shopping, you search for something. So entering a query is an action in and of itself, and that's vital. We need to know what the query was. And then what you do with the results of that query are trackable. So when you click a result, a click-through, you go to a detail page or a product page, for example, or if you were to, in an e-commerce setting, if you were add to cart, or if you added to a wish list, or in the workplace setting, a lot of things that I've done in the past for custom SharePoint implementations was adding a thumbs up button on the search result. So a user could like the result or they could dislike it, indicating whether it was helpful or not for that particular query. A bookmark, you can actually bookmark that result for later. You can email to a colleague. So all of these things are trackable through signals. And there are some that come out of the box, like click and download, and then anything else that's trackable. So to wrap up this answer, if you can capture an event from a front end and get the event to the back end, so you've captured whatever that event was, you can actually make that into a signal in Lucidworks Fusion. And then on top of that, you can weight them differently. And this is extremely important in e-commerce, but also important in workplace. So if you click something when you're shopping, that's important to that retailer. But if you add it to your cart, that's even more important. And finally, if you actually buy it, that's extremely important to that retailer. So those would be examples of having different weights. And that kind of ties back to one of my first examples where managed properties go into SharePoint often without the proper weighting in terms of relevancy. So weighting signals is important to get the most out of them, and that's the sort of thing that we would capture and track.
All right, John. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time. I'm going to hand it over to you to take us out in just a moment, but I did want to thank our audience for attending. And also, we will be recording and sharing out a link to this session. If you wish to review it again or share it with a colleague, just look for the link in your email within the next 24 hours. And John, I'm going to turn it over to you to take us out.
Okay. Thank you, Jill. Thanks, everybody, for joining me today. I appreciate your time here. And if you have more questions or you need some advice or you want to just discuss anything, I've included my email address there on this slide, and then there's a Twitter handle as well that you can contact me with if you want to do that. But I really appreciate your time. It's fun to talk about what you can do with SharePoint and how you can make it better by using a product like Fusion just for search and how they really marry well together. So I hope you consider that if you're in the SharePoint world and you're out looking for new search solutions.